The dust hung in the air like a curtain drawn by unseen hands, carried by a desert wind that whispered across the empty firing range where steel targets gleamed like teeth in the sun. A dozen men in uniform, faces weathered by deployments and training scars, stood watching as a single weapon sat heavy on its bipod, its black frame catching light in sharp glints. It wasn't just any rifle. It was the Barrett M82, the kind of firearm most civilians only ever saw in films or read about in books, a beast of .50 caliber steel and recoil that could turn concrete blocks into powder and punch through engine blocks like cardboard. These men had handled it before, carried it through combat zones where the difference between life and death came down to who had steadier hands under fire, and they knew well the weight that came with its presence. Yet today, oddly enough, none of them were behind its scope. Instead, their eyes drifted to her, the woman who seemed far too ordinary to be standing there under that blistering sun. She wasn't built like a soldier, didn't have the calloused hands or the weathered gaze of someone hardened by war. If anything, she looked like she belonged in the quiet corner of a kitchen, sleeves rolled up, humming to herself while preparing food, the type of person anyone might pass on the street without ever turning their head twice. But there she was, a soft silhouette against the harsh outline of desert sand, the figure who had become the center of a bet none of the men believed she could win. It had started as a joke, an offhand comment thrown out between drills, when one of the younger officers, still flush with the arrogance of freshly pinned rank, had scoffed at the way she'd been watching them train. She had been there as a visitor, someone's sister or cousin, no one even cared enough to ask, but the way she studied the rifles, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly, her gaze lingering on the way hands gripped the trigger, hadn't gone unnoticed. No one outside this unit could land a hit at that distance, the officer had said, nodding toward the farthest target on the range, a steel plate perched at nearly 2 kilometers out. His tone had carried the smugness of certainty, the kind that came from years of training drilled into muscle memory and the pride of belonging to an elite force. The others had laughed, agreeing, their voices carrying in the dry wind, until one of the older SEALs, a man with scars along his jaw and the heavy calm of someone who had seen too much, leaned back against the truck and said quietly, "Maybe she could." That silenced them. The officer had bristled. "Her? Come on, sir. That's a Barrett, not a pellet gun. She wouldn't even know how to load it, let alone make a shot." The older SEAL had only shrugged, the faintest trace of amusement in his eyes, and in the next breath, without warning, he had unclipped the rifle case, pulled out the Barrett, and placed it on the table in front of her. The desert heat seemed to ripple at that moment, the laughter of the men dying into silence as everyone turned, realizing the joke had suddenly become a challenge. She hadn't laughed, hadn't backed away, hadn't even seemed surprised. Instead, she had looked down at the massive weapon, her gaze calm, her fingers brushing over the cold steel as though reacquainting herself with something long forgotten rather than discovering it for the first time. That was the first time any of them had felt a prickle of unease. She should have looked intimidated, overwhelmed, maybe even frightened by the sheer size of the rifle, but she hadn't. Her hand had lingered on the receiver, her thumb tracing along the metal before she gave a small nod, like she had just been asked to carry groceries rather than attempt what trained marksmen sometimes failed to do. No one said anything for a long moment, the silence broken only by the desert wind, and then the officer had scoffed again, unable to let the tension settle. "Fine. Let's see it. One shot. Hit that plate and I'll believe it. But no one can hit that." His voice had been sharp, his arrogance still thick, but some of the others shifted uneasily, their instincts picking up on something their reason couldn't explain. The older SEAL had quietly handed her a single .50 caliber round, the brass casing glinting in the light like a piece of gold, and her fingers had closed around it without hesitation. She didn't fumble, didn't pause, didn't even ask where it went. She pulled the bolt back with practiced ease, slid the round into place, and locked it with the smooth, sure motion of someone who had done it before. That was when the men exchanged quick glances, the officer's smirk faltering for the first time. No one outside their circle should have known how to handle that weapon with such ease, and yet she had done it like it was second nature. She lowered herself onto the dirt, body aligning behind the rifle, cheek settling against the stock, eye lowering to the scope with a precision that spoke of familiarity rather than guesswork. The world seemed to narrow at that moment, the chatter gone, the laughter silenced, all of them watching her as the desert stretched out endlessly toward that tiny steel plate so far away it was barely more than a glint. She adjusted the bipod with a flick of her wrist, shifted her weight until her frame became steady, almost stone-like. Her breathing slowed, her chest rising and falling in measured rhythm, each breath more controlled than the last. The officer muttered something under his breath, a weak attempt at humor that died quickly in the air, because the longer they watched, the more they realized there was nothing random in her movements. Every action was deliberate, precise, refined, like a ritual she had carried with her from some hidden chapter of her life they knew nothing about. One of the men whispered, "She's done this before." The others didn't answer. No one wanted to admit they were starting to believe what moments ago had seemed laughable. Through the scope, her world was transformed. The shimmering mirage of heat waves blurred the distance, the target dancing faintly as the desert air rose in invisible columns. She knew instinctively the wind was cutting across from the left, steady but fickle at this distance, and without needing a flag or a gauge she adjusted 2 clicks, then a half-turn more, her fingers moving with the kind of certainty born not from guesswork but memory. A memory of other fields, other skies, perhaps long ago when no one had been watching, when no one had expected anything from her, and yet she had learned. The Barrett felt heavy against her shoulder, but not unfamiliar, and as her finger brushed the trigger, she exhaled slowly, emptying herself of doubt, of hesitation, of everything except the line between her and that steel plate. Behind her, the men shifted restlessly, their boots grinding in the dirt, but no one dared break the silence. Even the officer had gone quiet, his arms crossed too tightly, his jaw locked, because some instinct inside him told him what was about to happen would not match his words. The older SEAL leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing, watching not the rifle but her face, the calm etched into it, the kind of calm he had only ever seen on men who had fired under fire, who had survived chaos by making their mind into still water. And then, almost imperceptibly, she squeezed. The rifle roared, a thunderclap that ripped across the range, the shockwave pounding against the men's chests and sending a ripple through the hot air. Dust kicked up around her, the recoil shoving her back, but she absorbed it smoothly, body adjusting, unshaken. The .50 caliber round tore through the air, a streak unseen by the naked eye, carving across the desert toward that distant speck of steel. For a fraction of a second, silence held, the world suspended in anticipation, and then the sharp, unmistakable clang of impact rang out across the range. The steel plate shuddered, the sound echoing back like a bell tolling across the sand. No one moved. No one spoke. The officer's smirk collapsed entirely, his lips parting in stunned disbelief, his eyes locked on the plate that now bore a fresh scar at its center. The other men stood frozen, their minds struggling to reconcile what their eyes had just seen. Only the older SEAL moved, slowly exhaling through his nose, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as if confirming something he had already known. She lifted her head from the scope, brushed a strand of hair from her face, and sat up with the same calm she had begun with, her expression unshaken, almost indifferent, as though she had done nothing more extraordinary than close a door against the wind. For her, it had been simple. For them, it had shattered certainty. The desert seemed to stretch wider in that moment, the sun harsher, the silence heavier, and though none of them would admit it aloud, they all felt it. The shift, the quiet knowledge that the woman they had dismissed as ordinary had just done what they swore was impossible. The sound of the impact still hung in the air long after the shot had faded, echoing in their ears as if the steel plate itself had spoken a truth none of them were ready to hear. The officer who had taunted her stood rigid, his jaw locked so tightly it seemed his teeth might crack, his pride bleeding out into the dry dust beneath his boots. Around him, the other men shifted in disbelief, some exchanging quick, uncertain glances, others keeping their eyes fixed firmly on her as though afraid to look away lest the spell she had cast somehow vanish. The silence stretched on, oppressive and suffocating, until finally the younger officer snapped, his voice harsh, brittle, almost desperate. "That was luck," he said, louder than necessary, the words carrying into the desert air as though volume could make them true. "One shot, anyone can get lucky with one shot." But even as the words left his mouth, his own ears betrayed him, because none of them had ever seen luck look like that. They knew what desperation looked like behind a scope, what a flinch, a hesitation, a prayer looked like in the trigger pull of an inexperienced shooter. What they had witnessed wasn't luck. It was precision. It was experience. It was something none of them could explain, and the weight of that truth pressed down heavier with every second. She didn't respond. She didn't turn to face him or offer any words to defend herself. She simply brushed the dust from her sleeve, rose fluidly from the ground, and laid the Barrett back on the table with the same casual grace she had when picking it up. Her silence was sharper than any retort could have been, a refusal to dignify his arrogance with even a glance. The older SEAL stepped forward, his boots crunching in the dirt, his eyes never leaving her face. He wasn't smiling exactly, but there was a recognition in his gaze, the kind of knowing that came only from having seen things most men never spoke of aloud. He broke the silence with a voice as steady as stone. That wasn't luck. The words were simple, but they carried weight, cutting through the officer's brittle excuses like a blade. The others shifted again, tension coiling between them, some still unwilling to let go of disbelief, others beginning to accept that something extraordinary had just unfolded before them. The officer scoffed again, but his voice cracked this time, betraying the insecurity clawing at him. Then prove it. Do it again. For the first time she looked up. Her eyes, steady, calm, unreadable, met his, and for the briefest moment he faltered, as though under the weight of something he couldn't name. She didn't speak, didn't blink, just let the silence drag out until finally, with a faint shrug, she reached for another round. The men exchanged uneasy glances. None of them had expected her to accept, but there she was, sliding the brass casing between her fingers, her movements unhurried, deliberate, like she had all the time in the world. She lowered herself back onto the ground, shoulders settling against the earth, cheek pressing against the stock, the massive rifle aligning once more with her frame as though it had been built for her alone. The officer's smirk tried to reappear, forced and brittle, but already the cracks in his certainty were spreading. He had dared her, and she had accepted without hesitation. This time the wind had shifted, a faint gust sweeping across the range with irregular rhythm. Any trained sniper knew how treacherous such currents could be at long distances, turning a perfect shot into a miss with the slightest miscalculation. The men knew it, the officer knew it, and perhaps he clung to that as his last fragile shield. But through the scope, she read the air like an old book she had opened 1,000 times before. Her fingers made slight adjustments, not hurried, not hesitant, each movement confident, precise. Again, her breathing slowed, her body sinking into stillness, the desert around her fading away until there was only the rifle, the scope, and the line of her will stretching toward that distant plate. The seconds stretched. The men held their breath without meaning to, caught in the gravity of her focus. And then, again the thunder cracked. The recoil jolted against her, the sound booming across the sand, and once more the steel plate rang with a sharp, undeniable clang. The officer's face went pale. His lips moved, but no sound came out, his denial choking in his throat as the truth pressed itself into his bones. 2 shots. 2 perfect hits. No margin for luck. No room for coincidence. The others muttered softly among themselves, disbelief giving way to awe, the murmurs growing into a low ripple of voices that filled the silence. The older SEAL only nodded once, as though confirming something he had carried with him for a long time. She sat up again, not triumphant, not smug, not even proud. She simply placed the rifle back down, brushed her hands clean, and straightened as though she had finished nothing more remarkable than setting a table. It was that simplicity that unnerved them most. The younger officer finally snapped, unable to contain the humiliation clawing at his chest. He stormed forward, pointing a finger at her, his voice breaking into a shout. "Who are you? How the hell do you know how to do that?" His words cracked the fragile balance, but she didn't flinch. She regarded him with the same calm she had worn all along, her eyes cool, steady, unshaken by his fury. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost too quiet against the desert wind, yet it carried with an authority none of them could ignore. "Does it matter?" The simplicity of the response struck harder than any boast could have. The officer froze, his outstretched hand trembling faintly, his anger collapsing under the weight of her composure. She turned her back on him then, a gesture more cutting than words, and began walking toward the truck as though the matter were already closed. The men didn't move at first, torn between the rigid chain of command and the undeniable shift they had just witnessed. The older SEAL let her pass, his gaze following her with a mixture of curiosity and something deeper, something almost like respect. He had seen men break under fire, had seen others rise beyond what anyone thought possible, but rarely had he seen someone like her, ordinary in every outward way, yet carrying within her the calm precision of a ghost who had walked these roads before. He caught the faintest flicker in her expression as she reached the truck, a shadow of something unspoken, and it only deepened his suspicion that she was far more than she appeared. As the murmurs grew among the others, questions buzzing like restless flies, the officer tried again to reassert control, his voice sharp and defensive. "This doesn't prove anything. Anyone can," but his words faltered under the weight of their silence. None of them were laughing anymore. None of them were smiling. They had seen the impossible twice in a row, and no denial could erase the sound of steel ringing in the desert air. Slowly, one by one, their gazes turned back to the woman now leaning casually against the truck, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. It was in that silence that something unspoken passed between them all. A realization that the world was larger, stranger, and more complex than they had allowed themselves to believe. For the rest of that afternoon, the officer barely spoke, his pride in tatters, his authority undercut by the weight of what they had all witnessed. The older SEAL lingered near her, not intrusive, not demanding, but quietly watchful, as though he was piecing together a puzzle whose edges only she could reveal. He didn't ask, not yet. He knew better than to press, knew that if she wanted to tell them who she was, she would, and if she didn't, no amount of pressure would break her silence. The others, restless and unsettled, whispered theories among themselves. Some said she must have been trained secretly, maybe a military brat who had picked up tricks from someone in her family. Others thought it was impossible, muttering about luck again, though less convincingly this time. But the seed had been planted, and it grew in the quiet spaces of their minds. What if she was more than what she seemed? As the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the range, the group began packing their gear. The mood was subdued, thoughtful, heavier than it had been at the start. No one dared mock her now, no one dared meet her eyes too long, as though fearing what they might see reflected back. The officer avoided her entirely, his humiliation too raw, while the older SEAL gave her a small nod before climbing into his vehicle. For a moment, she remained alone by the truck, the desert wind tugging at her hair, her expression unreadable as the last light of day caught on the empty casing still gleaming in the dirt. She didn't pick it up. She left it there, a silent marker of what had happened, a reminder that sometimes the simplest people carried the deepest mysteries. That night, long after the desert sun had bled away into a sky littered with stars, the base sat wrapped in silence, the kind that carried whispers through thin walls and stirred unease in the minds of men who had once thought themselves unshakable. The younger officer, humiliated beyond repair, drank alone in the mess hall, his bitterness burning hotter with each swallow, his pride demanding an explanation he could not find. The others lay restless in their bunks, their dreams haunted not by battlefields or firefights but by the image of her calm eyes behind the scope, the sound of steel ringing twice like a church bell declaring an undeniable truth. Yet one man did not attempt sleep. The older SEAL, whose scarred jaw caught the faint glow of the moonlight as he stood by the window of his quarters, thought back over the years of his service, the countless shooters he had trained and seen in action, the countless more who had broken under pressure. What he had witnessed today was no accident, no fluke of chance. It was mastery, pure and unmistakable, the kind that did not come without long hours, grueling discipline, and battles fought in silence. He turned the memory of her movements over in his mind, the way her fingers had adjusted the scope without hesitation, the way her breathing had steadied in rhythm, the way the recoil had rolled through her body and been absorbed like she had expected it, prepared for it. She had the poise of a ghost from another war. Sleep did not claim him because questions weighed heavier than exhaustion. Who was she? What history lingered behind her unremarkable exterior, hidden behind the soft lines of a life that should have been ordinary? He had seen farmers' daughters hold rifles awkwardly, hunters take potshots with luck, even cadets stumble their way into skill, but none of them carried the calm certainty she had displayed. Her silence haunted him more than her skill. She had not gloated, had not defended herself, had not sought praise. She had simply done what was asked twice and dismissed it as though it meant nothing. That kind of composure did not belong to someone untested by fire. That belonged to someone who had learned that survival was born from silence, that strength was found in stillness. He found himself restless, pacing the floor as he remembered the faintest flicker in her expression as she had walked away, that shadow of something unspoken, something that whispered of loss as much as strength. The next morning broke with the harsh glare of desert light spilling across the base, the wind carrying the scent of dust and fuel. Training resumed as though the day before had never happened, drills called, rifles fired, shouts cutting through the air in rhythm with the crack of rounds. But beneath the surface the mood had shifted. The younger officer barked orders louder than usual, desperate to reassert his authority, his voice brittle as though volume alone could patch the cracks in his pride. The others obeyed, but their eyes drifted more often than not toward her, standing once again on the edge of the range, not seeking attention but drawing it nonetheless. She wore the same plain clothes, her posture unassuming, her presence as ordinary as ever, and yet she had become the center of their thoughts, the shadow they could not ignore. Whispers followed her, curiosity gnawing at their discipline, theories multiplying in the quiet spaces between commands. At lunch, the mess hall buzzed low with speculation. Some swore she had been military once, maybe a sniper from another branch, hidden in the folds of classified files no one could access. Others scoffed at the idea but offered no better explanation, their doubts cracking under the weight of their own memories. The younger officer avoided the conversation entirely, his pride too raw to stomach it, while the older SEAL watched quietly, his eyes flicking to her as she sat at the far end of the room, eating with quiet precision, never once raising her gaze to acknowledge the stir she caused. She seemed utterly unbothered, utterly detached, and that only deepened the mystery. Finally, when the whispers grew too restless, the older SEAL pushed back his chair, the scrape of wood against floor cutting through the noise, and crossed the hall to her table. He didn't ask for permission. He simply sat across from her, his plate untouched, his gaze steady. She looked up then, her eyes meeting his, calm but cautious, as though weighing the measure of the man who had dared sit in silence across from her. For a long moment, neither spoke, the tension between them stretched thin, until finally he broke it with words spoken not as an accusation, but as a quiet acknowledgement. "You've held a rifle like that before." It wasn't a question but a statement, and her eyes flickered, just slightly, a ripple across an otherwise still surface. She didn't deny it. She didn't confirm it either. She simply lowered her gaze, speared another bite of food and chewed in silence, her refusal to answer speaking louder than words. He leaned forward, his voice dropping low, meant for her ears alone. "Men spend years learning what you did yesterday. Most never get there. But you did it like breathing. That doesn't come from nowhere." Again she didn't respond, but this time he caught the faintest tightening of her jaw, the kind of reaction someone had when touched upon a truth they would rather leave buried. He sat back, studying her with the patience of a man who had interrogated both enemies and allies alike, and in her silence, he began to piece together the edges of her story. She wasn't careless. She wasn't reckless. She was protecting something, maybe herself, maybe someone else, maybe a history too heavy to carry openly. When she finally did speak, it was not what he expected. Her voice was soft, calm, but carrying the weight of something unyielding. "You see too much." The words hung between them, not a threat, not quite a confession, but an acknowledgement of the truth he had been circling. He didn't press. Instead, he gave a faint nod, accepting the boundary she had drawn, and rose from the table without another word. She watched him go, her expression unreadable, and then lowered her gaze once more, returning to her meal as though nothing had passed between them. But the men who watched from afar saw the exchange and drew their own conclusions, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent, spreading like wildfire through the barracks. By evening, speculation had hardened into near certainty. She had been military once, they insisted, though no one could decide from where. Some claimed CIA, others whispered Delta, still others muttered about classified Black Ops units no one admitted existed. The younger officer scoffed at them all, desperate to cling to his denial, but even he could not erase the memory of the steel plate ringing twice under her scope. And through it all, she remained silent, offering neither confirmation nor denial, walking through the base like a shadow, untouchable, unshaken. That night, the older SEAL found himself unable to stay silent. He sought her out, finding her alone by the edge of the range, the stars burning cold above them, the desert wind tugging at her hair. She did not turn as he approached, did not flinch as his boots crunched softly against the sand. He stopped a few paces away, his voice low, steady, carrying none of the arrogance the younger officer had wielded but all the weight of quiet respect. "Who are you really?" The question lingered in the night, not an accusation, not a demand, but a plea for truth. For a long moment she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the desert met the sky. Then slowly she spoke, her words quiet but carved from steel. "Once I was someone else. But that life ended a long time ago." He felt the finality in her tone, the wall she had built around her past, and he knew pressing further would only drive her away. Yet the answer only deepened the mystery, for it was not a denial, not an excuse but a confession shrouded in shadows. He wanted to ask more, but something in her expression warned him off. A grief, a burden, the kind carried only by those who had lost more than they could speak of. So he stood in silence beside her, the two of them staring out across the endless stretch of desert, and though no more words passed between them, he understood something unshakable. She was not ordinary. She had never been ordinary. And the truth of who she was, whatever shadows it carried, was something that would not remain hidden forever. The following days stretched under the weight of curiosity and suspicion, the desert sun beating down on the range as though intent on burning away the layers of mystery she carried with her. But no heat, no interrogation, no whisper could unravel her silence. She remained steady, unshaken, walking quietly among them as drills thundered on and weapons clattered against steel, yet everywhere she went, eyes followed. The younger officer's pride had curdled into resentment, his humiliation festering like an open wound. He barked orders with more venom than before, his tone sharp, brittle, each command delivered as though volume could repair his broken authority. The others obeyed, but their glances betrayed them. Respect for him had thinned, while something else had begun to grow toward her, something not quite spoken but undeniable. The older SEAL, watching from the sidelines, measured the shifting tides in silence, noting how their loyalties wavered, how doubt gnawed at their discipline, how the echo of those two impossible shots had not faded but instead grown heavier with each passing day. She had become the unspoken center of gravity, drawing every thought back to her whether she willed it or not. It was on the fourth morning that the tension reached its breaking point. They had gathered for another round of long-distance drills, the Barrett gleaming in the sunlight like some silent judge waiting to pass sentence. When the younger officer's voice sliced through the air, harder than usual, his arrogance laced now with bitterness. "If you think she's so special," he sneered, glaring at the older SEAL who had dared defend her, "then let's see her do it again. But not at some still target anyone can hit with luck. Let's see her track something that fights back." His words were venom, spit into the air like a dare, and for a moment the men froze, unsure how far he would push. Then, with a sharp whistle, he signaled for one of the trucks to roll forward, its engine growling to life as it hauled a target rigged with a steel plate across the desert floor at speed. Dust rose in clouds behind it, the plate swinging erratically as the vehicle bounced over uneven ground, turning a difficult shot into one most wouldn't even attempt. The officer folded his arms, smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth, convinced he had set a trap she could not escape. "There," he barked. 2 kilometers out, moving at 30 miles an hour. "Let's see your miracle now." The men exchanged uneasy glances, their loyalty torn. It was reckless, unfair, and they knew it, but none dared challenge him outright, not with rank still heavy on his shoulders. The older SEAL's jaw tightened, but before he could intervene she stepped forward. She didn't speak, didn't hesitate. She simply walked to the table, picked up the Barrett, and lowered herself to the ground once more, her movements as calm and unhurried as they had been that first day. The officer's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, a flicker of doubt cracking through his arrogance, but he forced it back, clinging to his belief that no one, could land such a shot. The truck roared farther across the desert, dust plumes rising like smoke as the plate jostled and swung, a taunting silhouette against the shimmering horizon. She adjusted the bipod, settled her cheek against the stock and peered through the scope. Through her eyes, the chaos of the moving target resolved into rhythm. The jarring sways, the unpredictable bounces, the whipping dust, all of it fell into a pattern she could read like the lines of a familiar book. She tracked its motion, her breathing slowing, her heartbeat steadying until her body became stillness itself. The men around her held their breath, the air charged with anticipation. The officer muttered under his breath, his confidence fighting against the unease crawling up his spine. And then, with the same calm precision as before, she squeezed the trigger. The Barrett thundered, dust exploding around her, the recoil jolting through her frame, and across the desert the steel plate jolted violently as the round slammed into it dead center, the sound of impact echoing like a drumbeat of finality. The silence that followed was heavier than the desert heat. The officer's face went pale, his arms falling stiffly to his sides as though the weight of his arrogance had finally crushed him. The men erupted, shouts of disbelief and awe tearing through the air, some clapping, others swearing under their breath, their voices rising like a storm breaking over the range. Only the older SEAL remained quiet, his eyes locked on her, his suspicion now hardening into certainty. That shot hadn't just been skill, it had been mastery at the edge of human capability, the kind of shot that took years of discipline, training, and experience no civilian could ever stumble into. Whoever she was, whatever she had once been, the truth was no longer deniable. She was a ghost from a world they weren't meant to know. The officer tried to recover, his voice cracking as he shouted above the noise. "It's still luck. One hit doesn't prove," but before he could finish, the Barrett roared again. None of them had even seen her reload, but the second round tore across the desert, striking the swinging plate once more, this time shattering the mounting bracket and sending the steel disc clattering into the dust. The truck skidded to a halt, the rig dragging broken behind it, and the men fell into stunned silence once more, their disbelief now stripped to raw awe. She sat up slowly, lowering the rifle, her face calm, expression unshaken, as though she had done nothing extraordinary at all. The officer's words died in his throat, his authority collapsing completely in the face of what none of them could deny. She placed the Barrett gently back on the table, rose, and without a word walked past them, her steps measured, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The men parted unconsciously, giving her a path as though instinctively acknowledging something greater than themselves. The older SEAL's eyes followed her, his respect now laced with urgency, for he knew the time for silence was ending. If she could do that, if she could outshoot even their best without effort, then she wasn't just a mystery. She was a revelation, and revelations did not remain hidden long in a world like theirs. That evening, as the sun sank in crimson streaks across the desert sky, the older SEAL found her again, seated alone on a rock at the edge of camp, her silhouette sharp against the dying light. He approached slowly, his boots crunching softly in the dust, and stopped a few paces away. For a long moment he said nothing, only studied her profile, the calm strength etched into it, the weight of unspoken history pressing against the silence between them. Finally he spoke, his voice low but steady. "You're not just someone's sister or cousin or friend who wandered out here. You don't shoot like that without a past. And whatever it is you're hiding, it's not something you can keep buried forever." She didn't acknowledge him right away. The desert wind tugged at her hair, carrying the scent of dust and oil, and for a long moment he thought she might not answer at all. But then quietly she spoke. "Once I was part of something I swore I'd never be part of again. I walked away, buried it, tried to live as though it had never been. But some things never leave you. Some things you can't wash away no matter how far you run." Her voice was steady, but there was grief beneath it, a shadow of memories too heavy to speak aloud. He listened in silence, not pressing, knowing the cost of even those few words. At last she turned to face him, her eyes steady, unflinching. "I'm not your enemy. But I'm not what you think I am either. If you want to know more, you'll have to earn it." The weight of her gaze held him, steady as the scope of a rifle, and for the first time in years he felt the measure of someone who could see straight through him. He nodded once, a silent pact between them, and turned away, leaving her to the quiet of the desert night. But as he walked back toward camp, his mind turned with questions and possibilities, and one truth he could no longer deny: she was not ordinary. She never had been. And whatever past she carried was about to change everything for them all. Word of her impossible shots spread through the base faster than wildfire carried on the desert wind. By the 5th day, whispers had reached even those who hadn't witnessed it firsthand, men and women in uniform murmuring in quiet corners about the mysterious civilian who had outshot the Barrett like it was a toy, who had humiliated an officer in broad daylight, who carried herself with the unbothered calm of someone who had nothing to prove. The official story being told was thin, a half-truth that named her a visitor, a relative of a contractor who had simply got curious during training, but no one truly believed it anymore. Too many eyes had seen the way she handled the rifle, too many ears had heard the steel ring again and again, and the lies dissolved under the weight of reality. Her name became rumor, her presence myth, and already a legend was being built in the barracks, whispered in hushed tones as though speaking too loud might summon her shadow. Yet through it all she remained the same, quiet, unassuming, a silhouette on the edges of drills, neither seeking attention nor fleeing from it, carrying her silence like armor. But silence is fragile, and under pressure even armor cracks. It was during a simulated exercise that the first crack appeared. The unit had been tasked with a mock raid on a desert compound, a training run designed to test coordination under pressure, complete with drones buzzing overhead and blank rounds fired in thunderous volleys. She had been told to remain at camp, to stay clear of the operation, but by now her presence was a gravitational pull, impossible to ignore, and she found herself drifting toward the edge of the field as the drill unfolded. The younger officer, still seething from his humiliation, spotted her almost immediately. His lips curled into a sneer, bitterness spilling out in the form of venomous words. "Enjoying the show from the sidelines? Or do you think you could do it better?" His voice carried across the sand, drawing eyes once more, stirring tension like a knife drawn too quickly. She didn't answer, didn't rise to his bait, but her gaze shifted toward the compound where the mock enemy insurgents had been planted. Her eyes tracked movement with unsettling accuracy, noting angles, blind spots, weaknesses in their formation, things no untrained observer should have seen. The older SEAL, standing nearby, caught the flicker in her expression and felt his chest tighten. She wasn't just watching. She was analyzing. And in that moment he realized she was fighting herself, fighting the instinct to step forward, to take command, to reveal the part of her that she had buried. The drill unraveled faster than expected. The officer, eager to prove himself, overextended his squad, pushing too hard, too fast, splitting his men across open ground without proper cover. Blank rounds cracked through the air, but the mistakes were real, dangerous, the kind that in live combat would have left bodies in the dust. From the edge, she shifted uneasily, her composure faltering as the squad became tangled in chaos, their angles compromised, their coordination breaking down. The older SEAL saw it too, his jaw tightening, his instincts screaming to intervene, but this was only an exercise, until it wasn't. Somewhere in the chaos, one of the drones malfunctioned, its guidance system glitched, and it dropped its training payload too close, an explosive charge meant only for simulation landing with real force. The blast thundered across the field, dirt erupting in a violent plume, men thrown off their feet, shouts tearing into the air. The simulation had just turned into a real emergency. She didn't hesitate. Before any of them could react, she was moving, sprinting across the sand with a speed and precision that made even trained soldiers pause. She cut across the field, her steps measured, efficient, her body low as though every movement had been drilled into her bones. She reached the nearest fallen man, dragging him out of the smoke with the strength of someone far more practiced than she appeared, her voice calm, sharp, cutting through the panic. "Stay down, keep pressure here, don't move." Her hands worked quickly, binding wounds with strips of fabric, securing tourniquets with precision that no bystander should have possessed. The men around her froze, their training momentarily forgotten as they watched her move with absolute certainty, each action carried with the weight of experience born not from theory but from necessity. The younger officer staggered through the smoke, shouting orders, but his voice was drowned out by the clarity of hers. She directed men to cover, ordered suppressive fire with blanks to keep the simulation under control, coordinated evac for the injured, all without hesitation, her words carrying authority so natural it silenced dissent. The men listened. They obeyed her, not him, their trust shifting without question to the one person who seemed to know exactly what to do. Within minutes, the chaos had become order again, the wounded stabilized, the squad regrouped, the drill salvaged from disaster by the hands of the woman they had once dismissed as ordinary. When the smoke cleared and the echoes faded, the silence that followed was heavier than before. Men stared at her with wide eyes, their breathing ragged, their minds struggling to reconcile what they had seen. She stood among them, hair tangled by dust, sleeves streaked with blood that wasn't hers, her face calm but her eyes shadowed by something unspoken. The younger officer tried to reassert control, his voice hoarse, his words trembling. She had no right, this was my operation, but his protests died in the silence. No one listened. No one cared. They had seen where true leadership had come from, and it hadn't been from him. The older SEAL approached her slowly, his gaze steady, unreadable. For a long moment he said nothing, simply studying her as though weighing every detail, every motion she had made. Finally he spoke, his words quiet but carrying the weight of recognition. "You weren't just trained to shoot. It wasn't a question. It was truth laid bare." She met his gaze, her eyes steady, unflinching. For the first time, her silence broke fully, her words carrying the weight of a confession. "No, I wasn't." Her voice was soft, almost weary, but beneath it lay steel, the kind that didn't bend, the kind forged in fire and sharpened by loss. The revelation didn't come all at once, but in fragments, pieces scattered across the hours that followed. In the medical tent, as she checked on the injured with hands steady as stone, whispers grew louder. Some claimed they had seen her use techniques too specific, too exact, the kind taught only in advanced combat medicine. Others swore her commands carried the cadence of someone who had led before, who had worn rank she no longer bore. The story spread, mutating with each telling, but the heart of it was undeniable. She was not a civilian. She had never been. She had worn a uniform once, maybe even led men like them, and whatever past she carried, it had carved her into something both extraordinary and dangerous. That night, the camp sat restless, the silence broken by murmurs and questions too loud to ignore. The younger officer retreated into himself, humiliated beyond repair, his authority eroded completely, his anger festering like a wound that refused to heal. The others watched her with a mixture of awe and unease, no longer sure if they should fear her, respect her, or both. The older SEAL remained quiet, his suspicions now hardened into certainty. He knew what he had seen, what they all had seen, and though she might never tell them everything, he knew enough. She was a soldier once. A damn good one. Perhaps one of the best. When he found her again, she was seated at the edge of the camp, the desert night stretching endlessly before her, stars burning like cold fire above. He sat beside her without a word, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. Finally he spoke, his voice low even. "You saved them today. You saved all of us." She didn't answer right away, her gaze fixed on the horizon as though searching for something far beyond the reach of his words. When she did speak, her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "I didn't save them. I just did what had to be done." He studied her profile, the strength etched into it, the grief hidden in the corners of her eyes. "That's what soldiers do," he said softly. She flinched almost imperceptibly, as though the word itself was a wound. For a long moment she said nothing, and he knew not to push. But in the silence he also knew this truth. Whatever she had once been, whatever shadows she carried, the past was no longer buried. It was walking beside her now, undeniable, and sooner or later, it would demand to be faced. The storm of whispers turned into a tide that could not be stopped, and by the following morning, the command tent was buzzing with unease. Reports had been filed about the drone mishap, about the injuries, about how the exercise had nearly spiraled into disaster. And woven between the lines was her name, scrawled in testimonies of men who couldn't forget the way she had taken control, the way she had given orders that weren't hers to give. In any other case, a civilian who interfered would have been reprimanded, expelled, kept at arm's length, but this was different. Too many soldiers owed her their stability, too many admitted, grudgingly or openly, that without her they might not have walked off the field at all. The contradiction gnawed at the higher-ups. An ordinary woman who wasn't ordinary, a stranger who moved with the discipline of a veteran, who stitched wounds with the certainty of a combat medic and commanded squads with the authority of an officer.